Jorge. Welcome to OK Google. Tell me how.
Glad to be here. Gonna be.
Are you
What's that?
are you excited? I know we've we've been working on this video for like 3 weeks, and you've been trying to get me on the telephone to explain it and work on it. I'm sure you're sick of doing that.
No, not at all. I mean, I'm excited about it, the collaboration and getting this thing on a video. I think it's important to help out everybody else and get them do multi-cloud VPN. So excited. I'm excited.
We'll just jump right into it then. So I'm gonna start off with just being in the cloud console. You can see I got a project here, Amazon GCP VPN. I originally called this Amazon GCP Hug, but as I sort of got through the process, I realized that it was taking a long time, and I had several iterations, so I had to change the product name. But
I do like the hug aspect. Like, they're friendly to each other. They play nice with each other. This is not
absolutely.
This is not Xbox versus PlayStation. This is everybody's a happy family.
Or I don't know, Star Wars versus Star Trek.
Oh, you can't say that one. Blasphemy, you'll start a holy war.
Yeah, absolutely right. So, just kicking it off, I mean, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to create a new VPN instance. And the idea here is without some sort of instance available to test out the connection, I don't really have a way of working through it, right? Like, I got to have a VM in one side and a VM on the other side. And I think when we were talking, you really pointed out, like, having ping connectivity between the two was really important. That's sort of the first step.
Yeah, absolutely. So ping, and then at some point we want to test out SSH, make sure that we can go both ways.
Yeah, and one thing, I mean, you have way more experience, I think people know, in AWS versus me. I came from the Azure background. Around tags in AWS, are these tags particularly important when it comes to like how you assign rules and so forth? So I'm about a third of the way through creating my instance here, and I'm assigning a tag to it.
So this is where I give my disclaimer, especially when it comes to cloud. When I use tags in AWS, it was mostly filtering, building, things like that. I don't really use it as much for firewall rules or security groups. It wasn't really, but things change from one day to the next. So, I don't know, maybe 2 days ago they might have switched it out, and now it does a whole lot more than it did before. But really, it was only meant for billing purposes and other purposes as well, like filtering, but not really any concrete usage.
Cool. So I'm just using the demo tag, really, which seemed pretty simple. I think I might have added another tag. This is going to be a little bit of a series, but I wanted to point out that this particular VM was going to need it to be GCP connected. And the last thing I did on the VM in AWS was created a security group, because that definitely affects what rules are applied ultimately in connectivity, right?
Yeah.
The other sort of normal stuff here we don't really have to go over. I added an SSH key for myself to connect, and also added a rule so I could connect from home. But pretty straightforward. It wasn't really hard to create these instances per se, but once I had the instances going, I could more or less know that I had two VMs I wanted to connect. I had a few internal and external IPs as well.
Yeah. The one important thing we forgot to mention, creating VPNs, is make sure, kids, that you don't have overlapping side ranges.
That puts a stall on things when everything's in the same subnet across two vendors. I'd like to say I never made that mistake. Have you ever have you ever done that yourself?
Not myself, but I've seen somebody do something similar once, and it was just a chaos. I mean, they built like this whole network using overlapping saddle ranges, and they didn't realize till later on when things started going horribly wrong, and they had to rebuild everything from scratch.
Terrible. Okay, well, so when we get started here, going into, I'm starting off in GCP, and as you as I worked on this, and it really seemed like the best place to do. And I'll note that the actual connection to, or the place to set up a VPN is under hybrid connectivity. It's not under networking. That kind of caused me to stumble a little bit. I thought I would find it under networking or VPC, but I found it under hybrid connectivity.
Yeah, sometimes find somewhere where you don't expect it to be, and it takes a little bit of searching, but okay, it works.
So talk to me about the first choice here. Which type of VPN to create, whether it's a high availability or a classic?
So always go for the HA. Classic at some point may be deprecated, so I would highly recommend always going HA. When in doubt, go HA.
Yeah, and I'm not in this, I don't think in this session we're going to configure HA, but just having the ability to do it is important. And you don't get a SLA with Classic anyway, so it's a smart choice. So the first thing I'm doing here is creating a VPN gateway, and I'm just calling it GCP Gateway and connecting it to my default VPC. But this is sort of like creating the endpoint into the Google VPC out on the internet. So this is actually creating the spot where traffic will come in, right?
Absolutely. So that's kind of like your public endpoint that AWS will be connecting to. And then AWS then will have its own public endpoint as well.
Yeah. Does it matter what region I put it in per se?
Not really. I think whatever you like best. Maybe there's some particular reason that you need, I guess, really fast connectivity to AWS. You might want to put it in the same city if possible, or state.
Mm-hmm.
Just less miles travel.
So maybe like proximity to your locality, I guess. All right, cool. So that'll take a minute, or well, it actually won't take that long at all. And what it's going to give me is the IP of the location to go. And so I'm going to need to take that endpoint now and head over to AWS to actually to continue the configuration.
So we'll switch back over now and we'll begin doing the customer gateway, which is essentially telling AWS to know where the GCP gateway is, right?
Yep. The customer gateway is basically the GCP public endpoint. Or you could just say your router, your public router address, if you were doing this like hybrid or on-premises or something.
Right. And so I'm gonna stick that what Google calls their gateway, that IP address that I copied. I'm gonna stick that into the Amazon IP address for the customer gateway. So that's the first part of really sort of getting it going. Now I've got dynamic here and I've also got static. So you want to just talk about the difference there? What are we choosing when we look at when it says routing and dynamic and static?
So usually depends on your hardware. Most hardware nowadays support dynamic, which is BGP, which will automatically basically, I guess, send your routes over. as opposed to static, which are, routes that you have to manually put in. And the problem with that is if you change routes or add routes, you're going to have to manually put those routes in every time you make a change or add a route. So dynamic is basically just automatically bring over those routes without having to manually make any changes.
Okay, so if I use dynamic, basically the two services will talk to each other. They'll talk about the routes, and if I want to specify routes, that's when I would use static, right?
You are correct, sir.
All right, so I'll create that gateway. All that happens really quickly. What I'm going to do now, and I'm clear out my view here, is I'm going to create what's called the virtual private gateway. And as I understand it, and I'm not an idiot, unless you ask my wife, like what I'm creating here is like the Google equivalent of, the Amazon equivalent of the endpoint, right, into their VPC.
That's correct. Yeah, that's like your public endpoint. Like, let's say if you had a router, that would be your public endpoint on your router on the AWS side of things.
Okay, cool. So I'll name it something really easy. I'm a terrible typer, so I'm actually going to skip naming it. I didn't tag it, so I'll have to go back and figure out what the actual name is. But Amazon has this concept of attaching to the VPC. So what I'm doing is just taking the gateway now and attaching it to that software-defined network that they have for, that's how their software-defined network, the subnet that my tool works on. So sort of the last step that we have to do, and I'm going pretty fast here, is to create the VPN connection. And really to do that, all I have to do is specify the two gateways in AWS, the one that we created in Google, and then, the proxy here, which is the customer gateway, on AWS, and then the actual virtual private gateway that we created in AWS as well. I'm just specifying them when I create this VPN connection. So any thoughts there, or, any guidance for us out there?
Yeah, so just remember, I think this whole process is write down things, as you do them. So like your customer gateway would be your IP address on Google Cloud. So write that down. Your VPG or virtual private gateway, write it down on a notepad. And have those IP addresses ready and handy. And that way you don't have to backtrack later on.
So next step going down the line is I want to get that configuration. If we were doing on-prem, we would choose or on-prem to AWS, we would choose something like a Cisco router or F5. But in this case, we're just going to choose a generic router. And that just means anything, right?
Yeah, pretty much. And sometimes if it doesn't have your manufacturer there, you can just pick generic and just pick and choose the options that you need within the text file.
Yeah. And so folks kind of, would probably wonder, okay, well, why do we need this information? We have to go back to Google now with some information about what was set up in AWS. Because if you remember, like, we created a customer gateway, and then as soon as we had that IP, we jumped over to AWS, and we spent a good 7-8 minutes now in AWS creating their customer gateway, virtual private gateway, and then the site VPN. Once that's created, though, there's a ton of information that sort of needs to go along with it. And by getting this site-to-site VPN information and clicking download, essentially, I get this text file with all the information I need. Things like, what's the virtual private gateway IP address on the AWS side? In this case, it was 18.188.112.238, in case somebody ever wants to know that. But that's what it was. So it's just a ton of info that I'm going to need to go back to the GCP side.
Yeah, there's a lot of information there on handshaking, negotiation, encryption, all that kind of information that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go through some of it. So as soon as I get back to GCP, surprise, I'm going to have to tell GCP where the entry point into the AWS network is. So in our little form here, in GCP guy, we have to create the VPN peer gateway, or the peer VPN gateway. So I'm going to take that IP address that I created on the AWS side and got out of that little text file and populate it right in here.
Remember, this IP address is the same as, you know, your VPG. This is your virtual private gateway on the AWS side.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to pump that IP address in there, but you'll notice like I could do 1 or 2 or 4 interfaces. Is that really the HA portion of this whole thing, or why would I have 2 or 4 interfaces?
That is the HA portion. That way, if you have one interface that fails, it'll hop onto the other one.
Okay. So I'll create that out. Funny thing, as soon as I click create, I get more options, more things to do. I have to begin creating the VPN. So I go ahead and specify, you know, a few things. I specify a name, which is permanent. I'm just naming the VPN at that point. The next thing I do is specify IKE v1, which I'm guessing is like some kind of key trade-off algorithm or something. I'm not 100% sure what IKE is, but I do know that that's a key transferring technology, IKE is. And in order to use it, I have to have a pre-shared key. So that's another thing I'm going to get out of my text file is a pre-shared key. And that's essentially the encryption key. So you don't want to hand that out or trade that around. That's pretty important. One thing I do in GCP, we have to create a cloud router. And working with you, I figured out that this is where we are really specifying the IP addresses that are behind the subnet, or behind the VPN connection, and making them routable to everyone else out there in the world, right?
Yeah, that's where your route propagation happens. That's where you basically pull in the routes from AWS and vice versa. On AWS side, you just look in your subnets and routes, and you'll see the propagation happening there. It's good to check those to make sure that you're getting the routes from the other side as well.
Yeah, and this is where that ASN comes into play, right? You're specifying the Google ASN, which is its unique, essentially, network segment. In just a minute, I'm going to pull that out of the text file. I pretty much remembered that the Google ASN was 65,000, but in a minute, I'm actually going to need the other one, which is the one that Amazon specified. So I'll go ahead and create that VPN. And essentially, the two VPCs should be talking to one another, right? I mean, it'll take it a minute to get going here, but
yeah, like I mentioned earlier, that the way to make sure that they're talking to each other, you know, before fiddling with security groups and all that, is to check to see if we're not really talking, but just make sure route propagation is happening. You know, AWS should be able to see GCP routes, and GCP routes should be able to see the AWS routes.
Okay. All right, cool. So essentially the next step then is to configure BGP. And, you know, I do understand that BGP is essentially route broadcasting between the routers. And so I guess it's really not a big surprise that the first thing to do is configure that. And creating the BGP session is pretty straightforward. I just give it a name, and then I'm going to need that peer ASN. So BGP config, and the ASN is, and I got this out of the text file Amazon provided. right? 64512. Now they provide this BGP peer, but that got a little confusing when we were working for it because the 69254 address range, which is a 16 CIDR range, that's when computers can't assign addresses. So I did a little research, and that makes sense because we're essentially really only interested in the last octet of these of this CIDR range. Even though it is a 16, we really only care about the last octet. And if you click on the question mark over here on the other side, right, you'll see that we only have a 30 CIDR range for the Google side of that. So the cloud router on Google, the address has to be within a 30 octet calculation of this number here in the last octet. So I don't know a ton about IP subnetting, but what I do know is that the very next number is in that range. So 246 and 245. You know, if I start with 245, I provide 246 on the other side. I'm essentially assigning that number, and it's in that 30 range. So I should be good there.
Yeah,
Cool.
so these are basically your IPs for your range for your tunnel. This is just for the tunnel.
Got it. Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's a good way to think about it. Like we're setting up the tunnel IPs that it knows in between it. All right, cool. So we'll go ahead and see if BGP will configure. This can take a little while, but while I'm waiting for them to sort of communicate to one another, I can go back and just check the CIDR ranges of my VNet, because what I want to do is make sure that once that route is propagated via BGP over to AWS, it accepts it. So to do that, I have to go to the security group and allow it. So there's the Google VM security group. You might remember I created that. And I'm going to edit those inbound rules and add permission for all traffic in that Google CIDR range. And that's what you were saying earlier, like don't have the same ranges, right? Because it would be exactly the same.
Yeah, if you overlap your ranges, the traffic has no idea where to go or how to get out.
Yeah. And so coincidentally, I have to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to pull the 172 CIDR range from GCP and then create a firewall rule to allow that in GCP. If I don't, then we won't allow the traffic to come in from that other subnet. Okay, so that only takes a minute to get those rules set up. But the last thing to come up, I think I struggled with the most, and I hope this is going to help some people out there. We'll wait for the rule to finish, but when we go and check our sort of hybrid connection and whatnot, we should see that indeed under hybrid connectivity, if I can find it here, we should see the VPN actually working. So let's just scroll over and see, okay, is this what's it doing? Maybe I'll need to refresh here.
And sometimes it may take a few minutes to kick in.
Yep, there we go. Okay, BGP was able to talk to it. So yeah. The last, go ahead.
I was just cheering, that's all.
Well, it can be a real pain to get to that point. I mean, technically, I think the fastest you can possibly do this is about maybe 12 minutes, I would say. But, that's steady moving and not having any interruptions. So I'll let you talk about this last thing, because this is where I struggled, and that is on route propagation. And I'll go through the steps while you just sort of talk about it. It's on the AWS side.
So should I pronounce it as route or route?
Well, since we're in the United States, I'm going with route.
Rude. I thought it was route. All right. I like my route. So anyways, you're basically turning on route propagation. It allows AWS to receive the routes and AWS to send out the routes as well.
Okay, so I go to the route tables.
And you should see GCP in there.
Well, I don't yet because I still haven't gotten there. So here we go. There's a route propagation tab, and I got to choose that gateway and save it. So I had to back it up a little bit there. Here we go. Okay, so there you see the GCP route coming through. Cool. So I think we should test connectivity. You think we got it?
I think we're good as long as we did our security groups and firewall rules, right?
I hope so. So I'll SSH in. It's pretty easy in GCP. I'm going to switch over on the Amazon side. I'm going to switch over and grab one of these, grab my instance to see if I got connectivity.
By the way, do you say GIF or GIF?
I am a GIF guy, believe it or not.
GIF?
Yes, the only way.
I can't do GIF. It's the correct pronunciation is GIF, even though the author of it said it's GIF, but I think that's grammatically your pronunciation is incorrect.
Well, I'm logged in now, so I'm gonna let's just see if ping's there. Okay, yeah, and Ubuntu. I used Ubuntu on this because I wanted to make sure that I would have ping. So I'm going to copy that Google IP for the destination I want to ping. And so I'll paste it in. So I'm a cheater. And there we go. So connectivity between that VM. So we have connectivity going one way. Let's see if we get anything going the other way. If I can remember where it goes. All right. So there's my, I got to grab the AWS IP. So let me go back. I'm SSH'd in. Ping is available. Yay. And so I'll ping that VM on the Amazon side. Let me try that again. I don't think I copied it right. I really love Cloud Shell and being able to just SH in directly.
Oh yeah, that makes all the difference in the world.
All right, it's working. We successfully did it. And in under 15 minutes. It's pretty amazing.
Not bad.
Jorge, thank you for spending time with me today. It was a lot of fun, man.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was great fun. A lot of good laughs. Getting this to work.
And the GIF versus GIF rages on.